Millionaire CEO saw twins crying at hospital. What they did next shattered his cold heart. It was then that he heard them, two voices, young and desperate, engaged in what sounded like negotiations of the highest order. "We need $43.27, one voice said with the serious precision of a financial analyst. "Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story." Alexander Whitfield stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 47th floor, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a conquered territory. At 45, he commanded Whitfield Pharmaceuticals with the precision of a master chess player, each move calculated 3 steps ahead. His reflection showed a man carved from marble, 6 feet 3 inches of imposing presence in a charcoal Armani suit, the signature blood-red pocket square the only color against his monochrome appearance. Morning light caught his platinum blonde hair, making it gleam like spun silver. His pale blue eyes, almost colorless, surveyed his empire with the detached interest of a predator assessing territory. These were eyes that had watched companies crumble without a flicker of emotion, that had signed death warrants for smaller pharmaceutical firms with casual indifference. "The acquisition papers for St. Catherine's Children's Hospital are ready for your signature," his assistant Victoria's voice interrupted through the intercom. Alexander's lips curved into what financial journalists called the smile that kills, an expression devoid of warmth, the last thing failing companies saw before absorption into his pharmaceutical juggernaut. St. Catherine's had been hemorrhaging money for months, their outdated equipment and charitable approach to patient care making them ripe for his particular brand of corporate surgery. The acquisition would give Whitfield Pharmaceuticals control over the largest children's medical facility in the tri-state area, allowing him to streamline operations, eliminate redundancies, and implement treatment protocols that prioritized profit margins over prolonged care, efficiency over empathy. As Alexander adjusted his platinum cufflinks, each worth more than most people's monthly salary, he reflected on his path to power. The Whitfield name once meant something different in pharmaceuticals. His father, Dr. Edmund Whitfield, had built the company on principles of innovation and accessibility, believing that life-saving medicines should be available to all who needed them. Those ideals died with Edmund 15 years ago, along with any softness Alexander might have once possessed. Under his stewardship, Whitfield Pharmaceuticals had transformed into a multinational corporation controlling patents on dozens of essential medications. Where his father had seen healing, Alexander saw market opportunities. Where Edmund had found purpose in alleviating suffering, his son found profit in managing it. The transition hadn't been without casualties. Alexander's younger brother Marcus had walked away from the family business in disgust when Alexander began implementing his new vision. They hadn't spoken in over a decade, and Alexander had written off his idealistic sibling as a casualty of necessary progress. St. Catherine's represented more than just another business opportunity, it was a statement. By the time he finished restructuring it, the facility would serve as a model for corporate efficiency in healthcare, a monument to the power of pragmatic thinking over emotional attachment, a lesson to anyone who still believed medicine should prioritize people over profits. The elevator descended into St. Catherine's Children's Hospital with mechanical precision. The building itself offended Alexander's sensibilities. Outdated architecture wrapped around inefficient floor plans, decorated with whimsical artwork that served no functional purpose beyond making sick children smile. Soon, it would all be replaced with clean lines and cost-effective design. As the doors opened onto the pediatric oncology ward, Alexander's nostrils flared slightly at the antiseptic smell. He strode down the corridor with purposeful steps, his Italian leather shoes clicking against linoleum floors that would be replaced within the month. It was then that he heard them. Two voices, young and desperate, engaged in what sounded like negotiations of the highest order. "We need $43.27, one voice said with the serious precision of a financial analyst. "Exactly 43.27, echoed another voice, so similar they seemed like stereo speakers in perfect synchronization. Alexander paused. Around the corner, he found the source. Two small boys, no more than 8 years old, huddled beside a vending machine. They were mirror images of each other, wild auburn curls catching light like burnished copper, their faces bearing the kind of ethereal beauty that belonged in Renaissance paintings. What struck him immediately were their eyes, heterochromatic, with one hazel and one blue eye each, but in opposite patterns creating perfect symmetry when facing each other. The boy on the left had a blue left eye and hazel right, while his twin displayed the reverse pattern. Their clothing was deliberately mismatched. One wore a red striped shirt with blue jeans while the other sported a blue striped shirt with red jeans, yet somehow they achieved perfect balance together as if they were two halves of a whole consciously maintaining equilibrium. Between them sat a small glass jar filled with coins that caught the light. The boys were counting and recounting with methodical precision, their small fingers sorting pennies from nickels with practiced efficiency. Alexander found himself frozen, watching this intimate scene unfold. These children were attempting to solve a problem with determination he recognized in seasoned executives. There was something both heartbreaking and admirable in their focused intensity. The twins looked up simultaneously as they sensed his presence, their mismatched eyes widening in recognition of his authority. Alexander was accustomed to this reaction, his presence commanded attention. But these children didn't cower as adults typically did. Instead, they regarded him with direct, unfiltered assessment that only children possessed. "Are you here to take away the hospital?" one asked with startling directness, his small chin tilted up in defiance despite the tremor in his voice. The accusation hung in the air, delivered with brutal honesty that only children could manage. Alexander felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. These boys saw him exactly as he was, the villain in their story, the destroyer of their safe haven. But instead of backing down or offering empty reassurances, Alexander found himself genuinely curious about their perspective and their jar of coins, which they clutched protectively as if it contained treasure beyond price. "We're trying to help Nurse Carla," the first twin explained, his small hands cradling the jar. "She has cancer. Your company said her treatment is experimental and not covered," they said in unison, and Alexander felt that uncomfortable sensation intensify. "So we're raising money," the second boy added, his voice carrying naive optimism that Alexander had spent decades eliminating from his own worldview. $43.27, the first twin specified, as if this paltry sum could somehow challenge the pharmaceutical industry's carefully constructed profit margins. Alexander stared at these two small boys, these children attempting to take on a system that crushed full-grown adults without mercy. They sat with their jar of coins, their mismatched clothes, and their impossible symmetry, believing their pocket change could save someone they loved. It was pathetic. It was naive. It was everything Alexander had learned to despise about human nature, the tendency to let emotion override logic, to fight battles that couldn't be won, to believe good intentions could triumph over economic reality. And yet, as he looked into their perfectly mismatched eyes, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in over a decade: shame. "Your company," one said, his small voice carrying an edge of steel that reminded Alexander uncomfortably of himself. "Whitfield Pharmaceuticals. You're Mr. Whitfield, aren't you?" The recognition hit Alexander like a physical blow. These children knew exactly who he was. Not just the man come to acquire their hospital, but the architect of their desperation. "We researched you," the other continued, producing a crumpled newspaper clipping with the solemnity of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "After they told Nurse Carla, her treatment was denied." Alexander took the clipping with hands that felt strangely unsteady. His own face stared back at him from the business section. A photograph taken at last month's shareholders' meeting, where he'd announced record profits while defending the company's decision to increase prices on childhood cancer medications. "That's you, right? The man who decides who gets medicine and who doesn't." The question hung in the air like an indictment. Alexander had spent years insulating himself from the human cost of his decisions, surrounding himself with bureaucracy and corporate language that transformed individual tragedies into statistical abstractions. One of the twins pulled something else from his pocket, a photograph, creased and worn from frequent handling. The boy held it protectively against his chest before reluctantly extending it toward Alexander. "This is our dad. He died trying to get medicine for our mom when she was sick." Alexander took the photograph with trembling fingers and felt the world tilt on its axis. The image showed a man in his early 30s, standing beside a hospital bed where a frail woman held two infant boys. The man's face was hauntingly familiar, the same platinum blonde hair, the same pale blue eyes, the same aristocratic bone structure that Alexander saw in his own mirror every morning. "What was your father's name?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus Shepard. He changed his last name when he got married," said his real family didn't want him anymore. The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered in a manila envelope that felt heavier than it should for something containing only a few sheets of paper. Alexander had commissioned the test in secret using a private laboratory that specialized in discrete paternity determinations for high-profile clients. Now, as he held the envelope, he realized he was terrified of what it might contain. The waiting had been torture. 3 weeks since that encounter in the hospital corridor, 3 weeks of sleepless nights and haunted days, 3 weeks of seeing Mason and Miles' faces every time he closed his eyes. He had postponed the hospital acquisition indefinitely, claiming the need for additional financial review while privately wrestling with revelations that had shaken the foundation of everything he thought he knew. With surgical precision, a habit developed over decades of opening documents that could make or break companies, Alexander sliced through the envelope and withdrew the laboratory report. The technical language blurred as his eyes scanned the page, searching for the single line that would either confirm his worst fears or allow him to dismiss the whole affair as coincidence. Probability of paternal relationship, 99.97%. The paper fluttered from his fingers, settling on his mahogany desk with the weight of a gravestone. Mason and Miles Shepard were his nephews, the sons of the brother he had inadvertently destroyed. Alexander sank into his leather chair, feeling suddenly ancient despite his 45 years. The twins' mismatched eyes seemed to stare at him from every reflective surface in his office. They were family, the only family he had left in the world, and he had orphaned them through his own ruthless ambition. His private investigator had earned his substantial fee with remarkable thoroughness. The file he delivered to Alexander's penthouse apartment was 3 inches thick, bound in leather, and contained enough information to reconstruct the entire tragic arc of Marcus Shepard's life. Marcus had graduated summa cum laude from Johns Hopkins with a degree in biochemistry, followed by an MBA from Wharton earned while working nights at a free clinic in Philadelphia. Even in college, he'd shown signs of the idealism that would eventually put him on a collision course with his brother's empire. The photographs were the hardest part. Images spanning Marcus's entire adult life. Graduation photos showing a young man with Alexander's features but softer somehow, as if compassion had worn away the sharp edges that defined the older brother's face. Wedding pictures of Marcus and his bride, a pediatric nurse named Isabella Rivera whose radiant smile seemed to light up every frame. Then came the pictures from Marcus's brief entrepreneurial period. Press photos from the launch of Shepard Medical Solutions showing Marcus standing beside machinery in a small manufacturing facility, his face bright with hope and determination. The caption read, "Local businessman aims to make life-saving drugs affordable for all families." Alexander stared at that photograph for a long time, seeing echoes of their father's face in Marcus's optimistic expression. This was the brother who had chosen to honor Edmund Whitfield's legacy while Alexander had chosen to bury it beneath layers of corporate efficiency and profit maximization. The timeline that followed was a study in systematic destruction. Date by date, the investigator had documented how Whitfield Pharmaceuticals had methodically eliminated Shepard Medical Solutions' ability to compete through exclusive contracts, patent challenges, and market pressure. Decisions Alexander had made over lunch meetings or signed off on during brief consultations with his legal team. The most devastating document was a letter Marcus had written to his sons during Isabella's final illness, never sent but found among his papers after his death. Alexander read his brother's final words, hands shaking so violently that the paper rustled. "I tried to build something good, something that would have made your grandfather proud. He always believed that medicine should serve humanity, not the other way around. My own brother has become something our father would barely recognize, a man who sees sick children as market opportunities rather than lives to be saved. I don't know if Alexander even realizes what he's become, but I pray that someday he'll remember who we used to be as a family. You boys are the best of both your mother and me. You have her compassion and what I hope are the good parts of the Whitfield determination. Use those gifts to make the world better, not just more profitable." Alexander's hands were shaking by the time he finished reading. Marcus had known. His brother had known exactly who was responsible for destroying his dreams, and yet there was no hatred in these words, only sadness and desperate hope that Alexander might somehow find his way back to being the man their father had raised. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Whitfield felt the full weight of his power not as a tool to be wielded or a weapon to be deployed, but as a responsibility he had utterly failed to honor. Alexander stood outside the children's ward of St. Catherine's Hospital at 6 a.m. clutching a briefcase containing documents that could change everything or destroy what little remained of his relationship with the only family he had left. He had been standing there for 20 minutes, unable to summon the courage to push through the double doors that separated him from Mason and Miles. The morning shift was changing, and he watched through the reinforced glass as nurses hurried past with the efficient purposefulness of people who held lives in their hands. Some he recognized from his previous visit, the same staff he was planning to lay off as part of his hospital restructuring. Each face that passed was a reminder of the human cost of his business decisions. "You're here early," a voice said behind him, warm and tinged with a slight accent he'd learned to associate with genuine caring. Alexander turned to find a woman in her 30s wearing scrubs decorated with cartoon dinosaurs, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that couldn't quite contain the wisps that framed her kind face. This had to be Nurse Carla, the woman the twins were trying to save with their jar of coins. "You're Carla Rivera," he said, and watched her expression shift from professional courtesy to wary recognition. "And you're Alexander Whitfield," she replied, her voice carrying the same protective edge he'd heard from the twins. "The man who's going to fire me and close down everything these kids have ever known as home." Her directness was refreshing after years of dealing with people who told him only what they thought he wanted to hear. He admired her courage despite himself. Before he could respond, the sound of running feet echoed from inside the ward, followed by two familiar voices raised in excited chatter. The doors burst open, and Mason and Miles tumbled out in their perfectly mismatched clothing, their auburn curls wild from sleep and their heterochromatic eyes bright with morning energy. They stopped short when they saw Alexander, their expressions cycling through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope. Alexander knelt down to their level, bringing his face closer to theirs, and for the first time really saw the resemblance he should have noticed immediately. The bone structure was pure Whitfield, high cheekbones and aristocratic jawlines that would serve them well as adults. But their expressions held none of the coldness that had settled into Alexander's features over the years. "Your father was my brother," Alexander said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess himself. "Marcus was my little brother, and I loved him very much, even though I forgot how to show it." The twins' eyes widened, but they didn't seem shocked, more like they were having a long-held suspicion confirmed. "But it also makes me the man who killed your father," Alexander continued, forcing himself to maintain eye contact despite the shame burning in his chest. "My company destroyed his business. The stress of losing everything he'd built made him sick, and when your mother died and he couldn't afford his heart medicine." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The twins understood with the brutal clarity that came from growing up surrounded by medical terminology and adult conversations. "So you're the reason we're orphans," one said quietly but without accusation. "You're the reason Mommy died," the other added, his mismatched eyes never leaving Alexander's face. The twins looked at each other, engaging in another of their silent conversations while Alexander knelt before them, waiting for judgment from two 8-year-old boys who had more right than anyone to hate him. "Are you sorry?" one asked. "Really, really sorry?" the other added. "More sorry than I've ever been about anything in my entire life," Alexander said, his voice breaking. The twins nodded in unison, as if this was the answer they'd been hoping for. "Then we forgive you," they said together, their synchronized voices carrying the weight of absolution that Alexander didn't deserve but desperately needed. The emergency board meeting convened at 2 p.m. in Whitfield Pharmaceuticals' executive conference room, a gleaming space designed to intimidate with its floor-to-ceiling windows and imposing mahogany table. Alexander sat at the head, flanked by audit reports he demanded, while his 6 board members filed in with expressions ranging from curious to concerned. Victoria entered last, carrying her ever-present tablet and wearing a perfectly composed mask that Alexander suddenly realized he'd seen too often in recent months. She took her seat near the foot of the table, fingers dancing across her screen with practiced efficiency. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire, "we have a problem." He gestured to the stacks of files before him. In the past 6 months, Whitfield Pharmaceuticals has denied coverage for 347 treatments that should have been approved under our existing protocols. Every single denial was authorized using my digital signature. Board member Patricia Hayes, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had built her own pharmaceutical fortune before joining Alexander's team, leaned forward with interest. "Are you suggesting fraud?" "I'm stating it as fact," Alexander replied. "Someone has been using my electronic signature to systematically deny coverage for expensive treatments, particularly in pediatric oncology." The room erupted in murmurs of concern and confusion. Alexander's eyes swept across his board members' faces, reading their reactions with the skill of a man who had survived decades of corporate warfare. Most showed genuine shock and outrage, but not Victoria. His assistant sat perfectly still, her face composed into the same professional mask she'd worn for 7 years, her fingers no longer moving across her tablet screen. "The financial impact," continued board member Thomas Chen, "could be enormous. If these patients pursue legal action—" "They won't pursue legal action," Alexander interrupted quietly, "because most of them are dead." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander opened the first file and began reading names and ages, each one a life lost to corporate greed disguised as fiscal responsibility. An 8-year-old with leukemia, a 12-year-old with brain cancer, a 6-year-old with a rare genetic disorder. "Victoria," Alexander said suddenly, his pale eyes fixing on his assistant's face, "you've been unusually quiet." She looked up from her tablet, her expression perfectly calibrated to show concern and confusion. "I'm just processing this information, sir. It's quite shocking." "Yes, it is," Alexander agreed, "particularly since you're the only person besides myself with access to my digital signature." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria's composure never wavered, but Alexander caught the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated stress. "Sir, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Alexander said coldly. "I'm stating facts. You have signature access. You process all insurance denials. And according to the audit trail, every fraudulent denial was processed from your computer terminal." Victoria's mask finally slipped, revealing something ugly beneath the professional veneer. "Those treatments were expensive, Alexander. Prohibitively expensive. Someone had to make the hard decisions about resource allocation." "Someone did," Alexander agreed. "Me. And I never authorized any of these denials." "You authorized the protocol that prioritizes company profitability," Victoria shot back, her voice losing its respectful tone for the first time in 7 years. "I was implementing your vision." "My vision never included murdering children." Victoria laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Your vision has always been about profit over people, Alexander. Don't pretend otherwise just because you've suddenly developed a conscience." Alexander stood slowly, his imposing height adding weight to his words. "You're fired, Victoria. Security will escort you out, and we will be pressing criminal charges. You think firing me will fix this?" Victoria asked as 2 security guards entered the room. "You built a company culture that values money over human lives. I just took it to its logical conclusion." As the guards led her away, her final words echoed in the conference room, "You created me, Alexander. I'm exactly what you taught me to be." Alexander sat alone in his office as evening shadows stretched across the city, Victoria's words echoing in his mind like accusations. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to destroy his company's compassionate heart, he had created a monster that exceeded even his own capacity for coldness. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Whitfield, there are 2 children here to see you. They say they're your nephews." Alexander's heart lifted for the first time in hours. "Send them in." Mason and Miles entered with their characteristic symmetry, still wearing their mismatched but perfectly coordinated outfits. They approached his desk with the solemnity of diplomats bearing important news. "We heard about the bad lady," Mason said without preamble. "The nurses are talking about it," Miles added. "They're happy she can't hurt people anymore." Alexander gestured to the chairs across from his desk, watching as the twins climbed up and settled themselves with identical postures. Even in his darkest moment, their presence brought a warmth he'd forgotten was possible. "Are you sad?" Mason asked gently. "Really, really sad?" Miles echoed. Alexander considered the question with the honesty these children deserved. "I'm sad that I created a situation where someone like Victoria could hurt innocent people. I'm sad that I became the kind of person who would hire someone like that in the first place." The twins exchanged one of their silent conversations before Mason spoke again. "But you're going to fix it, right?" "We can help," Miles added eagerly. "We know lots of people who need medicine." And we know which doctors are really good at helping kids, Mason continued. Plus we know all the best hiding spots in the hospital if you need to think, they concluded together. Despite everything, Alexander found himself smiling, a real smile, not the practiced expression he'd worn like armor for so many years. I could use your help, he admitted. I want to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. The next morning found Alexander in an unusual location, walking the corridors of St. Catherine's with Mason and Miles as his guides. The boys led him through the facility with pride, introducing him to patients and staff members who clearly adored them. This is where the little kids get their medicine without being scared, Mason explained, showing Alexander a treatment room decorated with colorful murals and equipped with child-sized furniture. Dr. Patel tells funny stories while he gives shots, Miles added. It makes the kids laugh instead of cry. Alexander observed the efficiency hidden within the child-friendly environment, the careful organization of supplies, the thoughtful layout that allowed medical staff to move quickly when needed while maintaining a calm atmosphere for young patients. What he had dismissed as inefficient sentimentality now revealed itself as purposeful design centered on healing. And this, Mason announced with particular pride, is our reading room. The space was modest, converted from what had likely been a storage closet, but filled with well-worn books and comfortable cushions. A hand-painted sign proclaimed it, the story corner, where adventures begin. We read to the kids who were too sick to hold books, Miles explained. Nurse Carla says it helps their medicine work better when they're happy. The hospital wanted to make it bigger, Mason added, but they didn't have enough money. Alexander made a mental note to fund a proper library. Not because it would improve efficiency or boost PR, but because it mattered to these children, to his nephews. As they continued their tour, Alexander began to see the hospital not as a failing business to be stripped for parts, but as a community of caregivers working within severe constraints to provide genuine healing. What he had planned to dismantle suddenly seemed precious beyond measure. Uncle Alex, Miles said, tugging at his sleeve to draw his attention to a bulletin board covered with photographs. These are all the kids who got better and went home. Alexander studied the smiling faces. Children of all ages and backgrounds united by the fact that they had received care that saved their lives. Care that his company's practices had been making increasingly difficult to provide. How would you boys feel, Alexander asked carefully, if instead of closing this hospital, I helped make it better? The twins' faces lit up with identical expressions of cautious hope. Better how? They asked in perfect unison. I'm thinking of something new, Alexander explained, ideas forming as he spoke. A place where people who make medicine work together with doctors and nurses who give medicine. Where we can make sure treatments are available to everyone who needs them, not just people who can pay. The twins exchanged another of their silent conversations, their mismatched eyes communicating in ways Alexander couldn't decipher. Like what Daddy wanted to do? Mason asked finally. Exactly like what your father wanted to do, Alexander confirmed, feeling the weight of his brother's dreams settling on his shoulders. Not as a burden, but as a mantle he was finally ready to wear. Absolutely not. The words fell like a hammer in the Whitfield Pharmaceuticals boardroom. Harold Westfield, the company's largest shareholder after Alexander himself, stood with his hands planted on the polished table. This proposal is financial suicide. Alexander had just finished presenting his vision for transforming St. Catherine's into an integrated research and treatment facility, one that would provide care regardless of patients' ability to pay, while simultaneously developing more affordable medications. Our responsibility is to our shareholders, Patricia Hayes added, though with less conviction than Harold. This plan would slash our profits by at least 30% in the first year alone, and set a dangerous precedent, Thomas Chun concluded. If we start prioritizing patient access over profitability, every healthcare advocacy group in the country will demand similar concessions. Alexander watched his board members exchange nervous glances. These were people he had personally selected for their ruthless business acumen, their unwavering focus on the bottom line. He had created this culture of profit above all else, and now it stood as the greatest obstacle to his redemption. Victoria has been speaking to the press, Harold continued, sliding a tablet across the table. She's already approached Meridian Pharmaceuticals about your so-called erratic behavior and destabilizing leadership. Alexander scanned the email exchange displayed on the screen. His former assistant had been thorough in her betrayal, providing Whitfield's chief competitor with internal documents, strategic plans, and details about Alexander's sudden interest in St. Catherine's Hospital. Meridian is preparing a hostile takeover bid, Harold concluded. They're contacting our major shareholders as we speak, promising stability and a return to our core business model. In other words, Alexander said quietly, a return to letting children die when their treatments cut into our profit margins. The blunt statement sent a ripple of discomfort through the room. These executives had grown accustomed to discussing human lives in terms of market share and revenue streams, not mortality rates and preventable deaths. That's an unfair characterization, Patricia protested weakly. Is it? Alexander pulled up a document on the main screen, the audit report detailing Victoria's fraudulent treatment denials. Every person in this room approved the policies that made these denials possible. We created a system where it became acceptable, even expected, to prioritize quarterly earnings over human lives. We're a pharmaceutical company, not a charity, Harold shot back. We're a company founded by my father to create medicines that save lives, Alexander corrected. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that saving lives was supposed to be the point. Harold's expression hardened. If you proceed with this plan, I'll call for a vote of no confidence. You may be the CEO, Alexander, but the board can remove you. You're welcome to try, Alexander replied calmly. But before you do, you might want to read this. He distributed folders containing detailed analyses of every board member's decisions over the past 5 years, specifically those that had resulted in treatment denials, price increases on essential medications, and the suppression of more affordable alternatives. These aren't just internal documents, Alexander explained as his board members paled while reading. They're evidence in an investigation I've initiated with the Justice Department's Healthcare Fraud Division. Victoria wasn't the only one breaking the law. She was just the most brazen about it. This is blackmail, Harold sputtered. This is accountability, Alexander corrected. Something we've avoided for far too long. He stood, his imposing height allowing him to survey the stunned faces around the table. You have a choice. Support my plan to transform Whitfield Pharmaceuticals into a company my father would be proud of, or face federal investigation for healthcare fraud. And if we support your plan? Patricia asked carefully. Then we all work together to create something revolutionary, a pharmaceutical company that actually puts patients first. We'll still make profits, just not obscene ones built on human suffering. The boardroom fell silent as each member weighed their options. Alexander had given them an impossible choice: support a plan that went against everything they believed about business, or face potential criminal charges for decisions they had never questioned until now. I've scheduled a press conference for tomorrow morning, Alexander continued into the silence. I'll be announcing either our new direction or my resignation and full cooperation with federal investigators. The choice is yours. As he walked out, leaving his board members in stunned silence, Alexander felt lighter than he had in years. Win or lose, he was finally fighting for something that mattered. Alexander paced the length of his penthouse living room, rehearsing arguments for the morning's confrontation. Whether the board supported him or forced his resignation, tomorrow would determine the future of Whitfield Pharmaceuticals and his ability to honor his brother's legacy. The elevator chimed, announcing the arrival of his guests. Mason and Miles stepped into the penthouse with wide eyes, taking in the minimalist luxury of Alexander's private domain. Your house doesn't have any colors, Mason observed with a child's direct honesty. Or pictures, Miles added, running his fingers along the pristine white wall. Don't you like happy things? Alexander looked around at his home through their eyes, the monochromatic furniture, the absence of personal photographs, the carefully curated abstract art selected for investment value rather than emotional connection. It was a space designed to impress, not to comfort, to showcase wealth, not to nurture joy. I've never really thought about it, he admitted. I'm not here very often. Where are you instead? They asked in unison. You should show them the sad kids, he suggested. The ones who need medicine their mommies and daddies can't buy, Miles elaborated. I've tried explaining the human cost, Alexander said. They understand it intellectually, but they don't feel it emotionally. No, Mason shook his head emphatically. Not explain. Show. They need to see real kids, Miles insisted. With real faces and real names. People only care about things they can see, they said together, with the wisdom of children who had spent their lives observing adults in moments of crisis. Alexander considered their suggestion. The board members had spent years insulating themselves from the human consequences of their decisions, just as he had. Maybe what they needed wasn't more data, but a direct confrontation with the lives hanging in the balance. What if, he said slowly, thinking aloud, instead of holding the press conference at corporate headquarters, we hold it at St. Catherine's? And invite some of the patients and their families to attend. The twins' faces lit up with identical expressions of approval. And we could show your bored people our special places in the hospital, Mason suggested. Like where the babies get to hold their mommies even when they're really sick, Miles added. And where Dr. Patel fixed Tommy's heart when nobody else could. The memory wall too, Miles said solemnly. Where we put pictures of kids who became angels. Alexander felt his own heart constrict at the thought of this memory wall, a concrete reminder of lives that might have been saved with more affordable treatments. I think, he said quietly, that might be exactly what my board needs to see. Later that night, after the twins had fallen asleep in his guest bedroom, Alexander made calls to rearrange the next day's events. The press conference would now be held in St. Catherine's main atrium, preceded by a private tour for board members. He couldn't force them to care about the children their decisions affected, but he could at least make those children impossible to ignore. As he looked in on Mason and Miles, sleeping peacefully, their auburn curls splayed across pristine pillows, their small hands reaching toward each other even in sleep, Alexander felt a fierce protectiveness that transcended anything he'd experienced before. These children had awakened something in him that had been dormant for decades, the capacity to love unconditionally, to fight for something beyond personal gain. Tomorrow would determine whether Whitfield Pharmaceuticals could be transformed into a force for healing rather than profit. But regardless of the outcome, Alexander now understood that his own transformation had already begun, guided by the wisdom of two extraordinary children who saw the world with perfect clarity. The board members of Whitfield Pharmaceuticals stood awkwardly in their expensive suits and tailored dresses, clearly uncomfortable in the pediatric oncology ward of St. Catherine's Hospital. Alexander had arranged for them to arrive 2 hours before the scheduled press conference, long enough for a tour guided by the most effective ambassadors he could imagine, Mason and Miles. "This is Lily," Mason was saying, introducing the board to a 5-year-old girl with a colorful headscarf and a beaming smile despite the 4 stand beside her bed. "She-ha. But she's getting better," Miles added quickly, because Dr. Chen found a new medicine that works really well. "The medicine costs $8,000 a month," Mason continued matter-of-factly. Lily's parents had to sell their house to pay for it. The girl's mother, standing beside the bed, nodded confirmation. "We're living with my parents now. The insurance denied coverage because they classified the treatment as experimental even though it's been FDA approved for 3 years. Patricia Hayes shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the mother. Alexander knew she had personally approved the policy designating certain treatments as experimental despite their FDA approval status, a strategy designed specifically to limit expensive coverage claims. "And this is Joey," Miles continued, leading the increasingly subdued board members to the next room where a teenage boy sat with a chessboard. "He's super smart and beats everybody at chess. He wants to be a doctor when he grows up." "If I grow up," Joey corrected quietly, his thin fingers moving a knight across the board. "My treatment got denied last month. That's why he looks so yellow," Mason explained with clinical detachment. "His liver isn't working right anymore." Harold Westfield, who had been the most vocal opponent of Alexander's plan, looked genuinely shaken. "There must be alternative treatments," he suggested weakly. "There are," Dr. Elizabeth Morrison replied, joining the group. "Including one manufactured by your company, Mr. Westfield. Unfortunately, Whitfield Pharmaceuticals recently raised the price by 843%, putting it beyond reach of most insurance plans." The tour continued through the hospital, with Mason and Miles introducing the board members to patient after patient, children whose lives hung in the balance, families bankrupted by medical bills, dedicated medical staff struggling against impossible financial constraints. By the time they reached the memory wall, Miles had mentioned, a corridor lined with photographs of children who had not survived. Even the most hardened board members looked visibly affected. These were not abstract market segments or demographic data points. They were children with names and faces, hopes and dreams, all cut short by a system that valued profit above human life. "Before we head to the press conference," Alexander said quietly, "there's one more place the boys want to show you." Mason and Miles led the group to a small garden courtyard in the center of the hospital. Despite the building's overall shabbiness, this space had been lovingly maintained, with flowering plants and small benches arranged around a modest fountain. "This is where kids come when they need to remember that beautiful things still exist," Mason explained. "Even when they're really sick and really scared," Miles added. "Our dad made this garden," they said together, "before he died." Alexander felt his chest tighten at this revelation. "Marcus built this?" The twins nodded. He said hospitals needed growing things to remind people that they can get better too, Mason explained. A small bronze plaque confirmed their story, the Marcus Shepard Healing Garden. Where hope grows stronger than fear? Alexander watched his board members reading the plaque, making the connection between the garden's creator and their CEO's estranged brother. The story was coming together for them now. Alexander's sudden change of heart, his determination to transform the company, his inexplicable attachment to these two children. The press is waiting in the atrium, Dr. Morrison reminded them gently. We should probably head there now. As they walked, Harold Westfield moved to Alexander's side. You never mentioned your brother was connected to St. Catherine's, he said quietly. I didn't know until recently, Alexander admitted. Just as I didn't know these boys were my nephews, or that our company's policies contributed directly to my brother's death. Harold was silent for a moment, processing this information. The integrated care model you're proposing, he said finally. It's financially risky. Yes. But these children. Harold glanced back toward the oncology ward. What we saw today is the human cost of our business decisions, Alexander finished for him. Cost we've been deliberately blind to for years. They reached the hospital atrium, where journalists and cameras were assembled, along with hospital staff, patients, and families. At the front of the room stood a podium with the Whitfield Pharmaceuticals logo, and, beside it, a large covered easel. Have you decided? Alexander asked Harold quietly. Will you support my plan or call for my resignation? Harold looked around the room, his eyes lingering on Mason and Miles, who stood hand in hand near the front row. I think, he said slowly, we need to remember what business we're actually in. Alexander raised an eyebrow, waiting for elaboration. We're not in the business of making money, Harold continued, surprising Alexander with his words. We're in the business of making medicine. The money should be a consequence of doing the job well, not the primary objective. One by one, the other board members nodded their agreement. The tour had accomplished what months of arguments and data could not. It had made the consequences of their decisions impossible to ignore. Alexander stepped to the podium, the board members arranging themselves behind him in a show of solidarity that would have seemed impossible just hours before. Mason and Miles moved to stand beside him, their presence a reminder of everything at stake. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed atrium. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for Whitfield Pharmaceuticals and St. Catherine's Children's Hospital. He gestured to the covered easel, which Miles unveiled with a flourish to reveal architectural renderings of a modern medical complex. I'm pleased to announce the creation of the Whitfield Shepard Integrated Care Center, Alexander continued. A revolutionary facility where pharmaceutical research, treatment development, and patient care will exist under one roof, where the people creating medicines will work directly alongside the doctors prescribing them and the families depending on them. The room erupted in applause, but Alexander raised his hand for silence. More importantly, I'm announcing the establishment of the Marcus Shepard Foundation for Pediatric Care, which will ensure that no child is ever denied life-saving treatment because of financial constraints. Mason and Miles beamed up at him with identical expressions of pride and joy, a mirror of the emotion Alexander himself felt as he finally publicly embraced his brother's legacy. My brother Marcus believed that medicine should serve humanity, not the other way around, Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. Today, Whitfield Pharmaceuticals recommits itself to that foundational principle. As the press conference continued, with questions about implementation details and financial projections, Alexander found himself continuously drawn back to the twins standing proudly at his side. They had guided him through more than just a hospital tour today. They had led him back to the man he was always meant to be, the brother Marcus had never stopped believing in, even at the end. The path ahead would not be easy. Transforming a pharmaceutical giant into a force for genuine healing would face resistance from competitors, skepticism from industry analysts, and the weight of years of entrenched corporate culture. But with Mason and Miles beside him, Alexander finally understood what his father had known all along. That true strength came not from power or profit, but from the courage to put compassion into action. 6 weeks after the press conference, Alexander Whitfield stood in the empty living room of his penthouse, surveying the transformation. Gone were the austere white walls and minimalist furniture. In their place, warm colors and comfortable seating filled the space. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, mostly of Mason and Miles, but also older images Alexander had unearthed from storage. His parents, young Marcus, the brothers together as children. The adoption papers sat on the coffee table, the final hearing scheduled for the following week. Alexander ran his fingers over the embossed legal documents that would make official what his heart already knew. Mason and Miles were his sons now, not just his nephews. The elevator chimed, announcing their arrival. The boys tumbled into the apartment with their characteristic energy, school backpacks slung over their shoulders. Their excited chatter ceased abruptly as they noticed the changes. "You made your house happy," Miles exclaimed, spinning in a circle to take in the transformed space. "Do you like it?" Alexander asked, suddenly anxious for their approval in a way he'd never been with boardroom executives or business rivals. The twins exchanged one of their silent conversations before turning to him with matching grins. "It's awesome," they declared in unison. Mason approached the mantelpiece, studying the photographs with careful attention. "Is that you and Daddy?" he asked, pointing to a faded image of two blonde boys sitting on a dock, fishing poles in hand. "Yes," Alexander confirmed, throat tightening at the memory. "We were about your age. Grandfather Edmund took us fishing every summer at his lake house." "You're smiling," Miles observed, joining his brother. "Like, really smiling with your whole face." "I was happy then," Alexander admitted. "Before you got scared of caring too much?" Mason asked with the unsettling perceptiveness that still caught Alexander off guard. "Yes," he acknowledged, choosing honesty over comfort. "Before I convinced myself that success meant more than family. But now you know better," Miles stated with absolute confidence. "I'm learning," Alexander said, pulling both boys into a hug that would have seemed impossible mere months ago. Later that evening, after the twins had fallen asleep in their newly decorated bedrooms, Alexander sat at his desk reviewing medical files with a growing sense of dread. The boys' most recent examinations had confirmed what he'd suspected since learning about Marcus's heart condition. Mason and Miles carried the same genetic markers for early-onset cardiomyopathy that had contributed to their father's death. The condition was manageable with proper monitoring and medication, but the diagnosis cast a shadow over Alexander's newfound happiness. He had found his family only to discover they carried a potential death sentence in their DNA. His phone rang. "Dr. Chin from the hospital research department." "I've been reviewing the boys' genetic profiles," the doctor said without preamble. "The cardiac markers are concerning, but there's something else you should know." Alexander braced himself for worse news. "Their genetic mutation is actually quite fascinating from a medical perspective," Dr. Chin continued. "The heterochromia is just the visible manifestation. Their neural pathways show unusual development, particularly in areas associated with pattern recognition and emotional intelligence." "Meaning?" "Meaning your nephew's brains are wired differently than most people's. Their remarkable ability to communicate without speaking, their advanced comprehension of complex medical concepts, their emotional awareness, these aren't random traits. They're manifestations of a specific genetic pattern." Alexander processed this information. "Does this help us treat the cardiac issues?" "Potentially," Dr. Chin replied. "If we can isolate the beneficial aspects of the mutation from the harmful ones, we might develop targeted gene therapy that addresses the cardiac risk without affecting their cognitive uniqueness." "How experimental would this treatment be?" Alexander asked, thinking of all the experimental designations his company had used to deny coverage. "Very," Dr. Chin admitted, "but with Whitfield Pharmaceuticals' resources behind the research." Alexander felt determination replacing fear. He had spent decades building a pharmaceutical empire capable of developing cutting-edge treatments. Now that empire would serve its true purpose, saving the lives of two extraordinary children who had saved him from himself. "Start assembling a research team," Alexander instructed. "The best geneticists, cardiologists, and neurologists you can find. Budget is no object." As he hung up, Alexander looked toward the bedrooms where Mason and Miles slept peacefully, unaware of both the threat in their genes and the fierce determination of the man who now called himself their father. He had failed Marcus. He would not fail his brother's children. The grand opening of the Whitfield Shepherd Integrated Care Center drew coverage from major medical journals and news outlets across the country. The gleaming facility stood where St. Catherine's once struggled, a transformation so complete that only the preserved healing garden remained as testimony to what had come before. Alexander stood on the podium, flanked by Mason and Miles in matching suits, though Miles wore a red tie with his blue suit, while Mason sported a blue tie with his red suit, maintaining their commitment to complementary asymmetry. Before them spread a sea of faces: medical professionals, patients and their families, board members and reporters. Today we celebrate not just a new building, Alexander began, but a new approach to healthcare. One that recognizes the inseparable connection between those who develop treatments and those who receive them. He gestured to the innovative layout visible through the atrium's glass walls: research laboratories positioned adjacent to treatment rooms, conference spaces designed for collaboration between scientists and clinicians, comfortable areas where patients and families could speak directly with the people developing their medications. For too long, pharmaceutical companies have operated in isolation from the very people we claim to serve, Alexander continued. We've treated patients as customers rather than partners. Today that changes. As he detailed the center's revolutionary features, Alexander noticed a commotion at the back of the crowd. Victoria Walsh, his former assistant, was being escorted from the premises by security. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, her expression cold with hatred, his steady with resolution. Her betrayal had catalyzed his transformation, but she had no place in what came after. The press conference concluded with Mason and Miles cutting the ceremonial ribbon, their small hands steady as they officially opened the facility that would serve as both their legacy and their salvation. The genetic research program was already underway in the center's most advanced laboratory, though Alexander had chosen not to publicize this aspect of their work until they had promising results to share. As attendees toured the facility, Alexander found himself approached by a familiar face: Dr. Edmund Chen, his father's oldest friend and former research partner. "Your father would be proud," the elderly scientist said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is the Whitfield legacy he always envisioned." "I spent too many years forgetting that," Alexander admitted. Dr. Chen nodded toward Mason and Miles, who were enthusiastically leading a group of visitors through the pediatric wing. "Sometimes we need to be reminded of what matters. Those boys are extraordinary. They remind me of you and Marcus at that age." "Before I lost my way," Alexander said quietly. "Before the financial pressures of the pharmaceutical industry pulled you in different directions," Dr. Chen corrected gently. Edmund understood those pressures. He just made a different choice about how to face them. Alexander considered this perspective, the idea that his father might have understood, even forgiven, his temporary surrender to profit over purpose. It offered a measure of peace he hadn't expected. "I'd like you to join our research team," Alexander said suddenly. "The boys have a genetic condition, the same one that contributed to Marcus's heart failure." Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. "I suspected as much when I met them. The heterochromia, the unusual cognitive patterns, classic markers of the Whitfield variant." Alexander felt a chill. "The Whitfield variant? Your father identified it decades ago during his genetic research. It appears primarily in your family line: enhanced mental capacity paired with cardiac vulnerability." Edmund was working on treatment approaches before the company's direction changed under your leadership. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. His father had been researching the very condition that would later kill Marcus, research Alexander had abandoned as unprofitable when he took control of the company. "I didn't know," Alexander whispered, the weight of this new guilt threatening to crush him. "Of course you didn't," Dr. Chen said kindly. Edmund kept his most personal research private, but he preserved all his findings. They're probably still in the company archives. Alexander's mind raced. If his father had already made progress toward treating the condition, they might be years ahead in developing therapy for Mason and Miles. The research he had dismissed as financially non-viable might save the boys' lives. "I'll find those archives," Alexander promised, newfound determination hardening his voice. "And we'll finish what my father started." As Dr. Chen moved away to greet other guests, Alexander watched Mason and Miles charming a group of potential donors, their identical smiles and mirrored movements creating the magnetic impression that had captured his own heart. They had healed something broken in him. Now he would ensure they had the chance to grow into the remarkable men they were destined to become. The path forward was clear. He would leverage every resource at his disposal, every connection, every bit of influence to protect these children. The Whitfield legacy would no longer be measured in market share and profit margins, but in lives saved and suffering alleviated, beginning with two extraordinary boys who deserved the chance their father never had. The twins' 10th birthday party transformed Alexander's once sterile penthouse into a riot of color and noise. 24 children from the hospital's long-term care program raced through rooms once reserved for business associates and potential investors, their laughter a testament to the healing power of joy. Alexander stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Mason and Miles hold court among their friends. The past 6 months had changed them as much as it had changed him. They were still extraordinary, their heterochromatic eyes and mirrored mannerisms drawing attention wherever they went. But they were also increasingly ordinary boys who played video games, complained about homework, and occasionally tested the boundaries of Alexander's still developing parenting skills. "They seem happy," Carla Rivera observed, joining Alexander with a plate of birthday cake. She had become a frequent visitor to the Whitfield household, her role evolving from nurse to friend to something not yet defined but increasingly important. "They are," Alexander agreed. "The medication is working well. Their cardiac function has improved 15% since we started the modified treatment protocol." "I wasn't talking about their medical condition," Carla said gently. "I meant they seem happy here with you." Alexander considered this alternative measure of success, one that couldn't be quantified in laboratory results or quarterly reports. "I hope so," he said simply. "They've given me so much. I want to give them a normal childhood despite everything." "Normal isn't really in their vocabulary," Carla laughed. "Yesterday they were explaining genetic transcription factors to Dr. Patel. He said they corrected his understanding of recent research. They've been reading my father's journals," Alexander explained. "Ever since we found his research archives, they've been devouring everything related to their condition. Sometimes I find them asleep surrounded by medical textbooks most adults couldn't comprehend. They're determined to help find their own cure," Carla said with admiration. Typical Mason and Miles, never content to let others solve problems for them. The party continued into the evening, with most children eventually departing until only the core group from the hospital's extended care program remained for a sleepover. Alexander moved through the apartment, checking on blanket forts constructed in the living room and making sure medication schedules were maintained amid the excitement. In the twins' bedroom, he found Mason and Miles huddled over a laptop, their expressions intent. "What are you two plotting?" Alexander asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "We're reviewing Grandpa Edmund's research notes," Mason explained without looking up. "There's a pattern he almost found," Miles added, his mismatched eyes scanning complex genetic sequences displayed on the screen. "A pattern related to your condition?" Alexander asked, leaning forward to examine the data. The twins nodded in unison. "Grandpa thought the cardiac issues and the cognitive enhancements were connected," Mason said. "Like two sides of the same coin," Miles continued. "He was trying to find a way to keep the good parts while fixing the dangerous parts. But he ran out of time," they concluded together. Alexander felt a pang of regret, knowing his business decisions had redirected resources away from this research his father had considered vital. "And now you're continuing his work?" The twins exchanged one of their silent conversations before turning back to him with identical expressions of determination. "We understand the mutation differently," Mason explained carefully. "Because we live with it," Miles added. "We know how our brains work from the inside." Alexander studied their earnest faces, reminded again that these children were not just ordinary boys despite his attempts to provide them with normal childhoods. They were extraordinary in ways that went beyond their matching heterochromia or their synchronized speech patterns. They possessed insights that might unlock the very genetic puzzles that threatened their lives. "What have you discovered?" he asked, setting aside his protective instincts in favor of genuine curiosity. The twins launched into an explanation that blended advanced genetics, neurology, and their own unique experiences, finishing each other's sentences with practiced precision. Their theory that the mutation created neural pathways that both enhanced cognitive function and stressed cardiac tissue built upon Edmund's research but took it in directions the older scientist hadn't considered. "If we're right," Mason concluded, "gene therapy could target just the cardiac expression without affecting our brains. We'd keep our connection to each other," Miles explained, reaching for his twin's hand, "but our hearts would work properly." "You want to be research subjects in your own experimental treatment," Alexander realized, his protective instincts flaring again. We already are, they said together, their voices blending in the harmonious way that never failed to send chills down Alexander's spine. Before Alexander could respond, his phone rang, the private line reserved for medical emergencies. Dr. Chen's voice came through, tense with urgency. We've had a security breach at the research facility. Someone accessed the genetic samples and treatment protocols for the twins. Alexander felt ice forming in his veins. How serious? Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for. They took copies of everything related to the Whitfield variant research. Victoria, Alexander said flatly, meeting the twins' concerned eyes. His former assistant had access codes and knowledge of the security systems and a personal vendetta against him. Possibly, Dr. Chen agreed. The bigger concern is what they might do with the information. In the wrong hands, the genetic profiles could be used to develop targeted biological agents specific to carriers of the Whitfield variant. Meaning the boys could be at risk, Alexander concluded, his mind already calculating potential threats and necessary precautions. All carriers could be at risk, Dr. Chen corrected. Including you, Alexander. The mutation exists in your DNA too, just not fully expressed. The revelation sent a shock through Alexander's system. He carried the same genetic vulnerability as his nephews and his brother, a ticking time bomb hidden in his cells waiting for the right trigger to activate. Increase security at the facility, Alexander instructed, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. And send a full security team to my apartment immediately. No one enters or leaves until we understand exactly what we're dealing with. As he ended the call, Alexander found Mason and Miles watching him with the uncanny perception that allowed them to read emotions others might miss. Someone bad wants to hurt us, Mason stated rather than asked. Because of our special DNA, Miles added. I won't let that happen, Alexander promised, pulling both boys close. No one will harm you while I'm alive. The twins hugged him back with surprising strength for their small frames. We know, they said together. We'll protect you too. In that moment, surrounded by birthday decorations and sleeping children, Alexander realized that the greatest danger and the greatest hope resided in the same place, the unique genetic heritage that made the Whitfields who they were. The very qualities that made his nephews exceptional also made them vulnerable. The challenge wasn't just finding a medical cure, but keeping them safe long enough to implement it. The corporate wars he had fought seemed trivial compared to this new battle. One fought not for market share or profit margins, but for the lives of children who had become the center of his world. Alexander sat at his desk in the Whitfield Shepherd Center reviewing security footage for the 5th time. Nearly 3 months had passed since the data breach, with no clear indication of Victoria's intentions or whereabouts. The uncertainty had forced Alexander to implement extreme protective measures for Mason and Miles' private tutors instead of school, limited outings, constant security presence. A knock at his door interrupted his concentration. Dr. Edmund Chen entered, carrying a thick file and wearing an expression Alexander had come to recognize as cautious optimism. We've made a breakthrough, the elderly scientist announced without preamble. Based on the twins' insights about neural pathway formation. Alexander straightened, hope rising despite his attempts to remain measured. How significant? Revolutionary, Dr. Chen replied, spreading diagrams across the desk. The boys were right, the cardiac complications and cognitive enhancements are linked through the same genetic pathway. But they don't have to be. We've identified a vector that can target the cardiac expression without affecting the neural benefits. A cure? Alexander asked, barely daring to believe. A treatment, Dr. Chen corrected. One that would need regular administration but could effectively manage the cardiac risks indefinitely while preserving their cognitive uniqueness. Alexander studied the complex molecular structures and treatment protocols with the focused attention he once reserved for acquisition targets. How soon can we begin trials? That's the complicated part, Dr. Chen admitted. The treatment is highly personalized, designed specifically for the Whitfield genetic profile. Traditional clinical trials don't apply. Meaning? Meaning the first recipients would be taking a significant risk. We've conducted extensive computer modeling and laboratory testing, but ultimately, someone with the Whitfield variant needs to receive the actual treatment to prove efficacy. Alexander nodded, understanding immediately. I'll be the first subject. Dr. Chen's expression confirmed this was exactly what he'd expected Alexander to say. The boys won't like that. They've been quite insistent that they should be the first to receive treatment. They're children, Alexander stated firmly. I'm their guardian. The decision is mine. They're also genetic researchers who understand their condition better than anyone, Dr. Chun countered gently. They developed half the theoretical framework for this treatment. Alexander felt the familiar tension between protecting the twins and respecting their extraordinary capabilities. They weren't typical children, they never had been. Their insights had accelerated the research by years, possibly saving countless lives beyond their own. We'll discuss it as a family, Alexander conceded. But I want to be prepared for immediate treatment if the risk assessment looks favorable. As Dr. Chin departed with promises to finalize the protocols, Alexander turned to the window overlooking the center's main courtyard. The Marcus Shepard Healing Garden had been expanded and enhanced, becoming the heart of the new facility just as Marcus had envisioned years ago. Patients and families gathered there throughout the day, finding moments of peace amid medical challenges. Alexander spotted Mason and Miles sitting with a group of younger children, apparently telling a story that had their audience captivated. Despite the security concerns that had disrupted their lives, the twins had insisted on continuing their volunteer work with pediatric patients. Hiding won't make us safer, they'd argued with their usual unsettling wisdom. It will just make us lonelier. Watching them now, animated, engaged, using their unique perspectives to comfort others, Alexander felt a surge of pride mixed with lingering fear. They had inherited the best of the Whitfield legacy, his father's compassion, Marcus's idealism, and a determination that Alexander recognized as partially his own contribution. His intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Whitfield, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent about Victoria Walsh." Alexander tensed. Did she identify herself? "Yes, sir. She says she's Victoria's sister, Catherine Walsh. She has information about Victoria's plans regarding your research." Alexander hesitated, weighing potential threat against potential intelligence. Have security search her thoroughly, then bring her up. And double the protection detail on the twins immediately. Minutes later, a woman entered his office escorted by 2 security guards. The family resemblance to Victoria was evident, though Catherine's expression held worry rather than malice. "Mr. Whitfield," she began without preamble. "My sister is planning something terrible. Something I can't allow to happen, even though she's family." Alexander gestured for her to sit. "What exactly is Victoria planning?" Catherine placed a flash drive on his desk with shaking hands. "She's working with Meridian Pharmaceuticals. They've developed a targeted viral vector using the genetic data she stole, designed to trigger accelerated cardiac deterioration in anyone carrying the Whitfield variant." The cold calculation of the plan matched Victoria's methodical nature. She wasn't just seeking revenge against Alexander. She was targeting his entire genetic line, including the nephews he'd grown to love as sons. "Why are you telling me this?" Alexander asked, studying Catherine's face for any sign of deception. "Because my sister has become someone I don't recognize," she replied, her voice breaking slightly. "And because those boys deserve to grow up. Victoria's hatred for you shouldn't condemn children to death." Alexander picked up the flash drive, weighing it in his palm like a live grenade. "How much time do we have?" "Days, maybe less. The viral agent is complete. They're preparing for deployment, likely at a public event where you and the twins will be present." Alexander's mind raced through the calendar. The dedication ceremony for the new pediatric research wing was scheduled for the end of the week, a high-profile event that Mason and Miles had helped plan and were excited to attend. The dedication, he realized aloud. They'll target the dedication ceremony. Catherine nodded. "Everything you need to understand the biological agent is on that drive. Your researchers should be able to develop countermeasures if they work quickly enough." Alexander studied her, still wary of deception. "Why should I trust you?" "You shouldn't," she admitted. "But those files will prove I'm telling the truth. And for what it's worth, I disagreed with Victoria even when she was just denying treatments. What she's planning now crosses every moral line." As security escorted Catherine from his office, Alexander contacted Dr. Chin with urgent instructions to analyze the flash drive contents. Then he called Mason and Miles to his office, knowing they deserved to understand the threat facing them. The twins arrived minutes later, their intuitive grasp of emergency situations evident in their serious expressions. "Victoria is trying to hurt us," Mason stated before Alexander could explain. "Using our DNA against us," Miles added, his heterochromatic eyes solemn. "Yes," Alexander confirmed, no longer surprised by their perceptive abilities. "But we now have information that might help us stop her." The twins listened intently as Alexander explained the situation, their expressions shifting from concern to determination. The treatment Dr. Chun developed, Mason said thoughtfully, could it be modified to counteract Victoria's viral agent? Possibly, Alexander acknowledged. The research team is analyzing that possibility now. Then we need to accelerate the treatment timeline, Miles concluded. And we still need to hold the dedication ceremony, they said in unison. Alexander stared at them in disbelief. Absolutely not. We're canceling all public events until this threat is neutralized. The twins exchanged one of their silent conversations before Mason spoke again. If we cancel, Victoria wins. She'll just find another opportunity. We need to confront her directly, Miles added. End this for good. By using yourselves as bait? Alexander asked incredulously. That's not happening. Not as bait, Mason corrected. As the solution. Our genetic profile is both the target and the key, Miles explained. If Dr. Chin can modify the treatment to neutralize Victoria's weapon, we could turn her attack against her, they concluded together. Alexander shook his head, unwilling to risk their lives regardless of how logical their strategy seemed. It's too dangerous. So is living in fear, Mason countered softly. Waiting for someone to hurt us, Miles added. Alexander recognized the determination in their expressions, the same unwavering resolve he'd seen in the mirror throughout his business career. These boys had inherited more than just his DNA, they had his stubborn refusal to back down from a challenge. Let's see what Dr. Chin says about modifying the treatment, Alexander said finally. But I make the final decision about the ceremony. Your safety comes first always. As the twins left his office, Alexander turned back to the window watching the activity in the garden below. Patients and medical staff moved through the peaceful space, unaware of the biological threat being prepared against the very family that had created this healing environment. The irony wasn't lost on Alexander that the genetics which had given Mason and Miles their extraordinary abilities might also lead to their destruction. But he refused to accept defeat. Too much was at stake, not just the lives of two remarkable children but the future of medicine itself. The integrated care model they'd pioneered was saving lives daily, changing how patients experienced treatment, transforming the pharmaceutical industry's priorities. Victoria might have his genetic information, but Alexander had something more powerful, a renewed purpose that transcended personal ambition. He would protect his family and preserve their legacy, whatever the cost. The morning of the dedication ceremony dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Alexander stood before the mirror adjusting his tie, blood red against a charcoal suit, the signature Whitfield colors now worn with different meaning. No longer symbols of corporate dominance. They represented the transformation of his family's legacy. Dr. Chun had worked miracles in the 5 days since Catherine Walsh's warning. The modified treatment had passed every laboratory test, neutralizing the biological agent Victoria had developed while simultaneously addressing the cardiac vulnerabilities in the Whitfield genetic profile. The first human test had been completed yesterday on Alexander himself. He had overridden the twins' objections, insisting on being the initial subject. The treatment had triggered 12 hours of fever and discomfort as his immune system recalibrated. But this morning he felt stronger than he had in years, with early blood work confirming the treatment's effectiveness. Mason and Miles entered his bedroom without knocking, a habit Alexander had given up trying to change. They wore matching suits with their signature mismatched accessories, the formal version of their usual complimentary style. "You look better," Mason observed, studying Alexander's face with clinical precision. "Much better," Miles agreed. "Your color has improved and your hands aren't shaking anymore." "The treatment worked," Alexander confirmed. "Dr. Chun just called with the final analysis. My cardiac function has already improved by 7%, and my blood shows complete resistance to Victoria's agent." The twins exchanged their silent communication before speaking. "So we can receive the treatment now?" they asked in unison. Alexander nodded. "Dr. Chun is preparing your doses, but you'll need to remain in the medical suite during the ceremony. The side effects aren't pleasant." "No," Mason said firmly. "We need to be there," Miles added. "This is our fight too," they concluded together. Alexander recognized the futility of argument. These boys had faced more in their young lives than most adults, orphaned, chronically ill, targeted by corporate vengeance, yet they remained determined to stand their ground rather than hide from threats. The treatment takes 6 hours to provide full protection, Alexander reminded them. If you receive it now, you'll still be vulnerable during the ceremony. We understand the risk, Mason said. But hiding won't make us safer in the long run, Miles added. Alexander studied their determined faces, so young yet so wise. Your father would be proud of your courage, he said finally. As am I. The dedication ceremony for the Marcus Shepard Pediatric Research Wing gathered hundreds of guests, medical professionals, patients and their families, donors, and media representatives. Security was unobtrusive but comprehensive, with teams specifically watching for Victoria Walsh or anyone connected to Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Alexander stood at the podium, Mason and Miles beside him as he addressed the assembled crowd. 2 years ago, I stood in this same location with very different intentions. I saw a failing hospital to be acquired and restructured according to corporate efficiency models. What I failed to see was the community of healing that existed within these walls. He gestured to the twins. These extraordinary young men opened my eyes to what truly matters in medicine, not profit margins or market share, but the human lives we touch through our work. They helped me rediscover the legacy my father intended for our family name. As Alexander continued his speech, security personnel signaled the presence of unexpected guests at the rear entrance. Victoria Walsh had arrived, accompanied by 2 Meridian executives and carrying what appeared to be a gift box. Alexander maintained his composure, continuing his remarks while security discreetly moved to intercept the newcomers. But Victoria evaded them, working her way closer to the stage with the determination of someone executing a long-planned mission. Mason nudged Alexander, his heterochromatic eyes fixed on Victoria's approaching figure. She's here, he whispered. With the viral agent, Miles added, nodding toward the box she carried. Alexander subtly signaled security to stand down, following the contingency plan they'd developed. Victoria needed to believe her plan was working, needed to deploy her weapon where it could be neutralized rather than escaping to try again later. And so, Alexander concluded his speech, it is with great pride that we dedicate this research wing to Marcus Shepard, a man who understood that medicine must serve humanity, not the other way around. His legacy lives on in the work we do here and in the extraordinary sons he left behind. Applause filled the atrium as Alexander, Mason, and Miles cut the ceremonial ribbon. Victoria used the moment to move forward, positioning herself near the refreshment table where crowds would soon gather. Stay close to me, Alexander murmured to the twins as they moved toward the reception area. The boys nodded, their expressions solemn but determined. Victoria intercepted them before they reached the refreshments, her face composed into a reasonable facsimile of professional courtesy. Congratulations, Alexander. Quite a dramatic transformation from the man I worked for. People can change, Victoria, Alexander replied calmly. They can remember what truly matters. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. How touching. And these must be your nephews, the catalyst for this remarkable evolution. She extended the gift box toward the twins. I brought something to commemorate the occasion. We know what's in the box, Mason said quietly. A delivery mechanism for a genetic weapon, Miles added. Victoria's composure faltered briefly before she recovered. Clever boys. Just like your uncle, always one step ahead. Not always, Alexander admitted. I missed the signs of your ethical decline for years. Ethics? Victoria laughed coldly. You built an empire by denying treatment to sick children. You destroyed your own brother's company without a second thought. Don't pretend this moral awakening is anything but guilt and sentimentality. You're right, Alexander acknowledged, surprising her. I lost my way. I prioritized profit over people. I forgot what medicine is meant to do. Pretty words, Victoria sneered. But Whitfield Pharmaceuticals still controls patents on medications that could save lives. You still charge prices most people can't afford. The system you built continues crushing people, regardless of your personal redemption. Alexander recognized the wounded idealism beneath her anger, the same disillusionment that had driven Marcus away years earlier. The system is changing, he said quietly. Not overnight, but fundamentally. The Marcus Shepard Foundation has already provided free treatments to over 10,000 children. Our integrated care model has been adopted by hospitals in 12 cities. We're licensing life-saving medications at cost to developing nations. Too little, too late, Victoria replied, her finger hovering over a mechanism hidden within the gift box. It's never too late to change direction, Mason said suddenly, his young voice steady despite the tension. To choose helping instead of hurting, Miles added. Victoria looked at the twins, really looked at them perhaps for the first time. Two children standing their ground despite knowing exactly what she had planned for them, showing more courage than most adults she'd encountered. Your agent won't work anyway, Alexander said calmly. We've neutralized it. But deploying it here would still constitute attempted murder with hundreds of witnesses. Victoria's expression hardened. You're bluffing. There's no way you could have developed a countermeasure so quickly. We had help. Alexander nodded toward the twins. They understood the genetic mechanism better than your scientists did. For a moment, Victoria seemed to waver, uncertainty creeping into her determined expression. Then she straightened, resolution hardening her features once more. Even if you're protected, others carrying similar genetic markers could be affected. Collateral damage in a necessary correction. Her finger moved toward the trigger. Before security could react, Mason and Miles stepped forward in perfect synchronization, their small hands reaching out to grasp Victoria's wrists. Please don't, they said in unison, their mismatched eyes fixed on her face with the penetrating gaze that seemed to see past all defenses. People will get hurt, Mason continued quietly. Including you, Miles added. Violence always hurts the person using it. Something in their direct appeal. The simplicity of children cutting through adult rationalizations seemed to reach Victoria where threats and arguments had failed. Her hands trembled slightly. The company destroyed everything good in my life, she whispered, just like it did to your father. But hurting people won't fix that, Mason said gently. It just creates more pain, Miles concluded. Alexander watched this extraordinary exchange with growing wonder. These children, who had every reason to fear and hate Victoria, were treating her with compassion rather than contempt. They saw not just her actions but the wounded humanity behind them, a perspective Alexander himself was still learning to adopt. Security personnel surrounded them, carefully removing the device from Victoria's hands. As they led her away, her shoulders slumped in defeat, the fight draining from her posture. The ceremony continued, guests largely unaware of the crisis narrowly averted. Alexander guided Mason and Miles to the newly dedicated research wing where a portrait of Marcus Shepard hung in the entrance hall, his kind eyes and gentle smile captured perfectly by the artist. Your father believed in healing, not revenge, Alexander said quietly. Today you honored that belief more perfectly than I could have imagined. The twins studied their father's portrait with identical expressions of thoughtful reverence. He would have forgiven her, Mason said finally. Just like he forgave you, Miles added. Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. I never had the chance to ask his forgiveness. You didn't need to, the twins said together, their synchronized voices carrying absolute certainty. He knew you would find your way back eventually. How could he possibly have known that? Alexander asked, genuinely curious. The twins smiled identical smiles that transformed their serious faces into mirror images of their father's portrait. Because that's what family does, Mason explained simply. They believe in you even when you forget how to believe in yourself, Miles concluded. Alexander pulled his nephews close, these extraordinary children who had taught him more about courage, forgiveness, and purpose than decades in corporate boardrooms ever could. Together they stood before Marcus's portrait, 3 generations of Whitfields united by the genetic heritage that made them unique and the compassion that made them human. The Whitfield legacy had come full circle from Edmund's original vision of medicine that served humanity through Alexander's temporary surrender to profit and power, and now back to a renewed commitment to healing led by 2 remarkable children with mismatched eyes and perfectly matched hearts. Outside the windows of the research wing, patients walked in the healing garden Marcus had created years ago, finding moments of peace amid medical challenges. Inside, scientists worked on treatments that would save lives rather than maximize revenues. And throughout the integrated facility, the boundaries between those who created medicines and those who needed them continued to dissolve, replaced by partnerships built on mutual respect and shared purpose. This was the true Whitfield legacy, not measured in market share or profit margins, but in lives improved and suffering alleviated. A legacy worthy of passing to future generations, beginning with 2 extraordinary boys who had already proven themselves wiser than most adults they encountered. As if reading his thoughts, Mason and Miles looked up at Alexander with identical expressions of determination. We're going to make medicine better, Mason stated with absolute conviction. For everyone, not just people who can pay, Miles added. That's the promise, they concluded in unison, their heterochromatic eyes bright with purpose. And Alexander knew with bone-deep certainty that they would keep that promise, continuing the work their grandfather had begun, their father had championed, and he himself had finally remembered was the only legacy truly worth building.